Now, hello again. Urban areas generally offer better quality of life. As such, we tend to see people flocking to cities from rural areas, seeking job opportunities. In fact, towns and cities in southern Africa are said to have grown by 100 million people just in the last 20 years. Think about it. 100 million more people over the last 20 years have moved to towns and cities. But what urban strategies are in place to accommodate these large numbers? What does it mean, especially when we have informal settlements mushrooming at a very rapid rate? For more on this, I've got Mark Napier, Principal Researcher from the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, joining us. They've been doing some research on this. Dr. Napier, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your time. Well, on the back of the floods, the devastating floods in KwaZulu-Natal that we're witnessing, we've seen your reference to your article, your research that was done before this about the fast growth of informal settlements in the region and how this should be treated in order to manage them on a sustainable basis. We have quite a lot of them in and around Durban, for example.
Yes, good afternoon, and thanks for having me. We did just publish a short article, myself and Lise Leroux of Institute for Security Studies, to look at growth in the region. And the scenes from Durban, where I also grew up, are heartrending. But looking at the growth of informal settlements in the region and specifically in South Africa, it's set to continue for a long time, and people seeking to benefit from urban opportunities is very real, and everybody has to live somewhere. So the role of public planning is incredibly important. We've seen during the COVID time that the public health response is important, but what's unfolding in eThekwini is showing that town planning and the public planning response is important as well. And so vulnerable settlements, both informal and formal, are really at issue here. And how do we guide settlements in the future if it's an ongoing process of urbanization where numbers are going to continue to grow?
Yeah, so I mean, countries or local governments are going to need new urban strategy to deal with the growth, as you said, of informal settlements, because they're not going to go anywhere. I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. So new urban strategies or urban planning strategies are going to be required.
Yes, that's right. So the climate modeling shows us where things are going. The demographic modeling shows us where things are going in terms of the pressure on the need for accommodation. And the economic forecasts show us that poverty and inequality are also major challenges, because inadequate housing and unsafe places to live in are also a product of poverty and inequality. So these three things work together, but they do demand an urgent response and a long-term response. So the short term of what we're seeing now is the emergency response, the food, the water, the temporary shelter. But then what can we start to learn from that? How can we start to open up safe land, which looks at longer term trajectories of flooding and storms and extreme weather events of different types, and really starts to plan for that and uses the best of engineering, architecture, planning, to have an adequate public response to this. But cities are complex, and people look for opportunities in cities, and people have to be accommodated. And our regulations can't just cater to the rich and those who can access the formal systems. They need to cater to everybody in cities.
So how does that look like? I mean, let's just talk about informal settlements as an example, which are growing faster in the region, including here in South Africa. In your article, you talk about the need for sustainable, less regulated urbanization. So how does that take care of the poor?
Yes, it's a very difficult balance, because the basics of adequate housing, as is shown in our constitution and housing policies And even eThekwini's municipality is very progressive in responding to precarious settlements. So it's certainly not a lack of responsiveness, but it's how to balance the needs of all urban residents without setting standards so high. So they can be building standards, they can be property titling standards, they can be the processes for township establishment, the levels of service. All of these things need to be appropriate standards. So it's not looking at second best for poorer people, it's looking at a good standard for everybody, but something that's attainable for everybody. And how do you get that balance? But I think apart from addressing the precarious settlements most urgently, which Durban is good at doing, it's then in the longer term, how do we open up more land? Because if you're not proactively opening up safe land for people to settle on, then the informal market will take up the slack. If people cannot find places to live, we've written about this in a book called Trading Places, Accessing Land in African Cities. And in all across the region, the informal market will step in if there's no release of land, that's service land that's safe. So that's a long-term response, and it needs innovation and proactive use of the skills that are available.
Prof, thank you very much for your time. Very interesting thoughts. It needs more time for discussion, but basically local government has to really shift its mindset. You have to shift your mindset into the future, because the climate is going nowhere and storms are getting worse and worse, and flooding is going to come back in a different day in the future. That's a guarantee. Climatologists have told us, but we need now to start putting on different thinking caps about the future. How do we town plan? How do we urbanize in a way that's sustainable?